Hey everyone, Charles Wilson here from the DC Democratic Party. I want to welcome you back to Statehood Speaks, the DC Democratic Party's podcast, where we talk to local and national Democrats about why they are Democrats and what issues are important to them. I'm really excited today that our special guest is none other than Ankit Jain, DC's shadow senator. Ankit, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Charles. Glad to be here.
Thanks so much for joining. So, listen, we like to ask all of our guests the same question. We start the conversation off the same way. Why are you a Democrat?
Yeah, so I really got interested in politics and Democratic politics with President Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. And the Washington Post, they used to have something called the Kids Post. I don't know if people remember that. And I used to read the Kids Post. I was a kid. And they had an article about the 2008 presidential Democratic primary. And I read it and I was like, this Barack Obama guy seems pretty cool. Mm-hmm. And so I became a fan of President Obama, so followed him very closely. And what he said really resonated with me about making sure that we protect everyone in this country, make sure everyone has an opportunity to succeed, and especially the poor and the least, the ones who need the most help amongst us, have an opportunity to get ahead, and that we don't have a society controlled by the wealthy and the few, and rather it's the many who are controlling our government and our society. And making sure everyone has equal rights. That really resonated with me. And that is what made me decide to get involved in Democratic parties and what made me a Democrat.
Awesome. So for folks who don't know you well, what inspired you to run for this role and get involved in DC politics?
Yeah, so I'm a voting rights attorney in my day job. I support election reform and voting rights nonprofits. And I am very passionate about, voting rights and democracy. I really, truly do believe that democracy is the greatest force for good in this world. And here in DC, we don't have it, at least not fully. We don't have any voting representatives in the House, any voting senators in the U.S. Senate. And so just that dichotomy of advocating so hard for people's rights to vote, and then me, my neighbors, my loved ones not having that right, it made me very passionate about DC statehood issues. And so I've been involved in the DC statehood movement for several years, really just as an advocate. To start out, I would go to the lobby days that DC Vote would organize. I handed out yard signs to people for statehood, went to rallies, and just stayed involved in the issue. And then in early 2023, the DC Council rewrote our criminal code. Criminal code says every single crime in the city, how you can prove the crime, and what the penalties are for the crime. Mm-hmm. And because DC is not a state, and essentially we're a colony of the federal government, if we're being honest, any law we pass in DC is subject to congressional veto. So obviously you remember, Charles, the Republicans in Congress decided they wanted to make this an issue, a political issue. And so they distorted what the bill did and got to work vetoing it. And whatever people's opinion is about crime and justice issues in Washington, D.C., at the end of the day, the people of D.C., through their elected representatives, should be deciding what our criminal laws are, what our criminal penalties are, because we are the ones who deal with the consequences of those laws. And it was really frustrating to see that process. And unfortunately, it was successful where the Congress did overturn our criminal code. We're still operating under the old criminal code to this day, which is written in the late 1800s, makes no sense, totally out of date, and that is making us noticeably less safe. Mm-hmm. And so watching that, it was a frustrating experience for me. I thought that if we had stronger leadership in the statehood delegation, maybe we could have prevented something like that from happening. And so that's what made me start thinking about, hey, maybe I should run for this position, having the experience I did in advocacy world, doing voting rights advocacy, trying to get bills through the legislature in different states. And before that, I was at the Sierra Club doing environmental litigation, but also working very closely with the lobbyists on our team. And so I decided I wanted to throw my hat in the ring, got in the race in September of 2023, and then was elected. I won the Democratic primary in June of 2024 and was elected in November of 2024.
All right, great. Congratulations. You've been doing a great job ever since. So
yeah, I appreciate it.
What's the role of this position?
Yeah, it's basically like our elected lobbyist for our rights. I am the one who takes the meetings with senators and their staff, who works on the legislative strategy with our advocates, DC Statehood, DC Home Rule advocates, to make sure we're driving a strong message and a clear narrative on whatever bill we're either opposing or supporting related to Washington, D.C., mm-hmm. and then making sure that we get media attention to these issues and the media understands what's actually going on. And so I think of it as like elected lobbyists for our right. It's like, the difference between if you have a good shadow senator, they can drive those strong campaigns that can make good bills pass and stop bad bills from passing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have a strong shadow senator, then you don't have the strategy, the messaging, the lobbying that you need to get what you want out of Congress. So I'm up on the Hill trying to advocate for DC's rights and then and try to get the message out to the people as well.
All right, great. So where do you think we are in this whole statehood movement? There have been people who've been working on this for a long time, and we've made a lot of progress. But where do you think we are, and what strategies do you think we need to implement to take this to the next level?
Yeah, I know that things are not, a little bit are precarious in DC right now. And so when I say this, people sometimes look at me weird, but I do believe it. I think we're closer to statehood than we've ever been before. The statehood bill has passed the House now twice, and it doesn't require a constitutional amendment, by the way. It just is a simple bill that has to pass the House and the Senate and be signed into law by the president. We have some more support for statehood than we have ever had. And this Congress is not one that probably is going to pass DC statehood. And so what we're trying to do is get ready for a future Congress that is more positive towards DC, where we'll have a window will open up for us to pass DC statehood, and then to have a president who's willing to sign it into law. And so we are building that support and making sure that we have people who recognize the need for DC statehood in Congress. I will say that everything, I'm sure we're going to talk about everything that's going on over the past year, but all of the attacks on DC we've seen from this Congress, from this president, I think have made the case for DC statehood even stronger than we had ever been made before, because people are seeing across the country what the impacts are of our lack of statehood. It's not just that we don't have representation in the Congress, which we don't, but also we can't govern ourselves day to day because we're not a state. The Congress and the president keep on butting in and trying to essentially use this as a testing ground for their far right agenda. And they wouldn't be able to do that if we weren't a state. And so we're trying to make that case across the country to members of Congress. And I think that members of Congress are having to vote on these bills now. And I don't think they came to DC to decide what local traffic policy should be in Washington, DC. And so they're seeing the consequences firsthand themselves. And so we're trying to use that to make the case to them about why they need to support DC statehood. And I do believe that when we have a future Congress and president that support statehood, that should be coming in the next near to medium term future, that when that happens, that we will have the votes to pass DC statehood.
Great. So, I'm glad you brought that up, because I often say that one of the biggest hurdles for statehood now is public education.
Mm-hmm.
For folks outside of DC. What kind of work have you done to help educate Americans who live in other states about this issue and how it might impact them?
Yeah. I mean, I think I totally agree with you that public education has always been the biggest obstacle. Some people don't even realize that normal people live in DC around the country. They think it's just all lobbyists and politicians, and we're just average human beings just like you. We're teachers and janitors and bus drivers and every job that someone has somewhere else in this country. We're the same as the rest of you, and people don't realize that there are 700,000 people, normal everyday people, living in Washington DC. And so that has been an issue. And the other issue is that even if they realize that, they don't realize that we are not a state, and that we don't have voting representation, I should say. And so when I tell people around the country that, in Washington, D.C., we don't have any votes in the House or the U.S. Senate, almost everybody I talk to says, what? That's crazy. And obviously, immediately they understand the injustice of it. And so we need to continue the education so people can understand what's going on. And I think that what I try to do is whenever these attacks come up against DC, I try to use that as an education tool. Look at these things they're doing to us, things that get as nitty gritty, and this is true, as deciding where right turn on red is allowed and banned on streets in DC. Like, how would you feel if the U.S. Congress was telling you, your city, where you're allowed to turn right on red and where you're not? Is that something you would support for your city? And if not, why would you support it for Washington, D.C.? And if you don't support it for Washington, D.C., then you should support DC statehood, because it's the only way to stop this from happening. Until DC becomes a state, they can continue to do these kinds of things, attacking DC. And so that's the kind of public education I try to do, is using these concrete examples as an argument for DC statehood.
Great. And my understanding is that you're the first Asian American elected in DC.
That's citywide, yes. Citywide,
Yes,
yeah.
first Asian American elected
Yeah.
citywide in
Yeah.
DC. How has your background shaped your view on how we attack this?
Yeah, definitely has had an impact. And I'll just say that I grew up hearing stories about how my parents had to sleep in line overnight outside the local immigration office to get my dad his green card and get him on a pathway to a vote. And people came up to them and they thought they were homeless. They were trying to give them food, and my parents had to tell them, and like everyone in line had to tell them, no, we have food, we have a home, we just want to be U.S. citizens.
Hmm.
And so when you hear those kinds of stories growing up, I think it gives you a different perspective on the issues facing this country. And one of the things we've seen with President Trump's attacks on DC is that he's really focused on the immigrant community in DC. He's really focused on terrorizing the immigrant community. All these ICE raids, all of the rhetoric and demonization has especially hit everybody, but especially the immigrant community in DC. I remember when he first took over control of our police force, President Trump. I was talking to a Venezuelan delivery driver,
Hmm.
and a friend of mine was helping him out, trying to provide support to him, and so we went to deliver some groceries to him, and he didn't. He was so terrified of what was happening that he had basically not left his house for the past week, and that meant that he couldn't make an income, and so he didn't have money to buy food and put food on the table for his family. And so, we were supporting him, and I was talking to him, and the question he asked is, when is this going to end? We
Hmm.
can't keep on living like this. And this is someone, by the way, who's a legal immigrant into DC, had like asylum status and all of that. And he was so terrified, even with the legal paperwork, that he'd be arrested and sent to jail first, and they check his paperwork later, that he wasn't willing to leave his house. And so that has been a through line of the president's attacks on DC. I have really focused on trying to support the immigrant community in DC, including the Asian American community. And having come from that immigrant background, I kind of understand, I think maybe a little bit more than others might, the fear that people face from those, even if you're a legal resident. And I'll just share one other story. My grandfather lives with my parents in the DC suburbs in Fairfax County, and so he was, when I was running, my grandparents were coming in helping me out. When Trump got elected, my mom actually decided that they weren't gonna do anything even possibly politically related,
Hmm.
because she just was worried about their immigration status and like jeopardizing their immigration status. So I he had marched with me in parades in the past, and like this past April of last year, I asked if he wanted to march in the Emancipation Day parade with me, which is a big parade that DC does every year. And my mom was like, "No, he's not marching in any parades." It wasn't even a political event, right? But it just didn't want to even take the risk of being close to a political event. So that's a very real fear in the immigrant community in DC. And so just trying to understand that and fight for immigrant communities has been a big focus of mine.
I appreciate you sharing that story.
Mm-hmm.
Final question: If you can share with our listeners, who want to get involved in this
Mm-hmm.
statehood effort, how can they do it? Where do they start? Who do they talk to?
Yeah. So, there's a few things I'd say. I mean, if you're not in DC, then you have voting senators and voting congressmen or a congresswoman to advocate for DC and to vote on laws impacting DC. So the Congress is repeatedly bringing forward anti-DC laws repealing DC policies that they don't like. And in fact, there's going to be a vote on one in a committee on Wednesday. They're going to be voting on getting rid of every single traffic camera in DC, including at schools, including at playgrounds, literally nowhere in the city. And they're going to be that law would require, the way I read it is, it would require right turns on red at every intersection in the city. So this is not like saying you can turn right on some intersections. This is every intersection in the city, you have to be allowed to turn right on red. There are some intersections of the city where you have not been allowed to turn right on red since like the Stagecoach.
Mm-hmm.
And it's dangerous. There's some intersections that are like, very heavily trafficked, heavily foot traffic. You shouldn't be turning right on red right in Chinatown, right next to Capital One Arena, right next to the Gallery Place metro station. And so it just goes to show you, like, they have no understanding of what the laws they're passing actually impact would be on the ground. But those kinds of laws are being voted on regularly. And so if you live outside of DC, I would ask that you call your senators, you call your representative, and tell them to vote no on these laws attacking Washington, D.C. The one that's coming up for vote on Wednesday is H.R. 5525. And then tell them to vote yes on D.C. statehood and other policies that are impacting D.C. And so I think that, people, obviously D.C. statehood is the ultimate goal. But there are things we can do in the interim to advance things forward. So just as one example, Delegate Norton has for many years had a bill to allow DC to control its own National Guard. And you're seeing the impacts of the inability to do that right now. And you saw it on January 6th most poignantly, where President Trump refused to call in the DC National Guard, and our Mayor Bowser, had no authority to do so herself. And that caused real peril for representatives and Congress people who were in the Capitol at the time. And if the mayor had that authority, she would have used it immediately. And if the mayor had the authority over the DC National Guard, you might not see the current Guard presence in DC. What has happened is that the courts have ruled that everywhere outside of DC, the president cannot send in the National Guard. Mm-hmm. But it's a little bit more complicated in DC because our mayor doesn't have control of our National Guard, because we're not a state. And so that litigation is still ongoing. And so there's a lot of medium-term bills, and I'll just say one more. I am a strong believer that the federal government should not be telling us how tall our buildings are in D.C., which they do currently. They have a Federal Height Act, and that should be left to our elected representatives who actually understand the views of the constituents of D.C. So, it should be our representatives from Ward 2 and at-large and Ward 6 and all the other wards who are deciding how tall our buildings are, not a senator from Vermont or Wyoming. And so can we get the council back the authority to over the height limit in DC, replace the Federal Height Act with a local height act? Those are the kinds of, I think, medium-term bills that we can push forward. And that's actually one I think you can get some bipartisan support on, because you've seen Republicans show an interest in building more housing, building more affordable housing. And so those medium-term type bills, we want the people who have a vote in the Congress to be voting for those bills until we get to statehood. So call your congressman, call your congresswoman, call your senator, tell them to support those bills and oppose the bad bills. Now, if you live in DC, obviously we don't have any voting representatives in Congress. That's the whole problem. But I think that even in DC, there's some education work that can be done about the value of statehood and the impacts of the lack of statehood. And so I would tell people to tell their friends about, here's the consequences of DC's lack of statehood, and which are very real. I mean, you're seeing right now all these bills that the Republicans are pushing because DC is not a state. But even before this most recent, attack on Washington, D.C., we have had our criminal justice system is just one example. There's so many. I'll just give one. It's controlled essentially by the federal government. And so we have our MPD under control of the local police, local criminal justice system controlled by the federal government. And that has serious consequences, because that means that the U.S. Senate, the president nominates and the U.S. Senate confirms every single local judge in Washington, D.C. And these local judges are their last priority of the U.S. Senate, unfortunately. And that really is across both parties, I have to say. And so what happens is the Senate does not confirm judges, the president does not nominate judges, and that has resulted in a judicial vacancy crisis in D.C., where something like 20% of all court seats in D.C. are open, both at the local, trial court level and the Court of Appeals level. And that means that trials are delayed, justice is denied, people are out on the streets, who have maybe committed crimes. People who have not committed crimes, who are charged with a crime, have this thing hanging over their head for years and years. It just makes our city less safe, less just. And that's because we're not a state. And that's a real consequence. Crime rates, I think, are higher in DC because we are not a state. And that's a real impact that is impacting Washingtonians everywhere. Just a few months ago, the U.S. Attorney for DC, who prosecutes all adult crimes in DC, including local crimes, decided that she wasn't going to prosecute illegal carrying of firearms anymore. Mm-hmm. It's open season now. You can carry firearms anywhere you want in D.C. is what she's saying, and I'm not going to prosecute you. That's ridiculous and insane, especially from an administration that claims to want to make D.C. safe. And that only can happen because we're not a state. And so those are real consequences on people's everyday lives because D.C. is not a state. And so I think we need to continue that education. And the best person to do that education is trusted people in your network, right? And so if you can educate your friends and family about the lack of statehood, that would be important. I'm going to make one more pitch, which is that when you file your taxes as a DC resident, You can there's a box you can check at the very end. It's Form U if you're doing your taxes by paper. If you're doing it on a tax preparation software, it's just like at the very end you can press a link to see additional options, and you can donate money to the DC statehood delegation, which is myself and the other shadow senator and shadow representative. And we do rely on the donations from DC taxpayers to support our office's activities. So if you're willing to donate, whatever you can, 25, 50, even more if you can, to the delegation, that would be very helpful to help our elected officials do their advocacy to protect our rights. And by the way, we've worked hard to make sure that you could file your taxes on time. This effort by Congress to cause chaos in DC tax filing season and rewrite DC's tax code was not successful, and that was in part because of the advocacy of our offices and many other people within DC. And so if you're open to giving some of that refund back, we could definitely use the support. And you can just follow for updates. Free DC is a great organization that does a lot of events. And you can check out my website at Senator Jain.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Great to have you, Charles.
Yeah, and you're welcome back anytime. So if you get any updates, hey, reach out. We'll love to have you back on.
Yeah, great to be here, Charles.
All right. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.